So thank you all very much. This is my book, Spirals in Time, the paperback. The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells. And I want to come back to the title, Spirals in Time, a little bit later in my talk. But first, just want to talk a little bit about that subtitle, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells. This was the subject of a comment on the Guardian website. I did that thing that authors, and actually anyone I would recommend not doing, which is reading below the line and looking at various comments of people. This was on a lovely review of Spirals in Time that the Guardian wrote, and it was, in fact, that's one of the quotes from it at the top, which I'm very pleased to be able to grab out. The rewarding glimpse of another world, which is very lovely. But anyway, so I know I had a little bit of a look down, and most of the things that people were writing were very nice as well, but one reader felt it necessary to say that subtitle, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife, is clearly the kind of twee, infantile title that publishers of popular science books like this impose on authors, and why do they do it? And frankly, we don't like it. Now, a couple of things that I quite enjoy about that. One is that then the next person down on the list actually said, shut up, I quite like it. It does what it says, it tells you what's in the book, what's wrong with that? And the other thing is that it wasn't my publisher who insisted that this is the title of the book. It was actually an idea I got from my mum. And I'm really glad that she did come up with this idea, because I am terrible at titles. I'm just the worst thing. I'm fine at writing all the words in the middle, but choosing just a few to put on the front cover is the hardest thing of all. And so I basically kind of farmed it out to all my friends and family. The title of my first book, which was a book about seahorses, that was a friend of mine came up with that. The Poseidon Steed was the name he came up with. Thank you very much. And yeah, my mum sort of it was partway through writing the book. And I was having trouble figuring out what to call it, and by this point my mum I'd been talking to her about seashells a lot, and she'd been reading bits of the book, and she just sent me a little email saying, you know, how about something about life and afterlife, you know? And I thought, well, that's really wonderful. I like it, we'll have it. But particularly because it meant that she really got what the book is about and what I'm trying to do in this, which is two things really. The secret life, first of all. Of the animals that make seashells. This is the one of the big things I'm trying to do with this book is to show people behind these objects that we all know. If you've been to the beach and you've seen seashells, you've eaten them probably and had mussels and oysters and so on, and seen the shells they've left behind. But what I really wanted to do is bring to life the animals that make them. And so I'm talking about mollusks, an extraordinary group of animals, mostly in the oceans, although some of them have come up on land. Talking about creatures like, I hope you can see that, snails of sea and land, lots and lots of lovely snails. Limpets, that's a blue-rayed limpet in the middle there, which is a lovely tiny little thing you get in the British shores. Looks kind of tropical and exotic, but it's one of ours. Very tiny, about the size of a fingernail. Chitons, this guy at the bottom is a chiton, which is a kind of mollusk with a shell made up of lots of plates across its back. And if you were to knock one off a rock, it curls up like a woodlouse. And they live all over the place, clamped to rocks generally at the edges of the sea. The biggest of all the seashells, the mollusks that have shells, are the giant clams. And if you can just make out this picture of my husband, a scales for scale, ouch, sorry, and it's a wonderful giant clam, which is probably at least 100 years old. They grow to about 200 kilos. They're fantastic creatures. You can't see in this picture because it's quite deep and very blue, but they have beautiful colours from partly from algae that live in their tissues, which help them to harness energy from the sun, gives them nutrients, but they are quite fabulous creatures. There are other mollusks that are much less well known, things like the chambered nautilus. There's a few species of these that live in the open oceans. They live in the deep sea and generally rise up at night. I've never seen one alive. I've seen them in aquaria, and they're wonderful things. And things like these have been around for a very long time, and they're rather fantastic. So chambered nautilus, they have a particular type of shell, which we'll come back to. Then there are a bunch of mollusks that don't have shells as we know them. There are octopus that have lost their shells. except this one in the top left-hand corner has borrowed a shell from something else, from some kind of cockle, and trying to hide inside it. I think that's also a piece of coconut. They're very clever. They find other ways of making themselves shelters without having their own shell. There are slugs. This is a beautiful sea slug that I saw, I think, in Fiji. I think the slugs that live in the sea are absolutely beautiful and wonderful, and I wouldn't mind them crawling along my finger, but as soon as they evolved life on land, I'm really not interested, can't stand land slugs, but they're sort of the same group of animals, basically in the same bit of the mollusks as the snails, only these ones have either pretty much lost or reduced their shells. And then there are squid. That's a squid up in the top right-hand corner. And I don't know if any of you recognise this shell. Maybe you might have seen one on a beach if you look out for them. They look a bit like normal snail shells, but actually it's the internal shell of a type of squid. It's called the ram's horn squid. You can kind of guess why. It's got that lovely spiralling shape. And a bit like the chambered nautilus, which I just showed you, it uses that shell for buoyancy. It's actually got air inside it. There's chambers, it's sort of divided up. And so the squid use them to help them keep them sort of floaty underwater. So most mollusks with shells have them on the outside, but a few actually have evolved to put them on the inside. Cuttlefish are another one. That cuttle bone you might have seen also washed up on beaches, that's a kind of modified seashell. So the secret life of seashells, really what I want to try and do is expose the lives of some of these wonderful creatures and the sort of all sorts of things they get up to, from the very deepest parts of the ocean to the shoreline, and a few of them, as I say, make it up onto land. And they're an extraordinarily diverse bunch, an extraordinarily successful group of animals. They've been around for at least 500 million years, probably much more longer than that as well. They're one of a very ancient group of animals, and they're incredibly successful, and there's still tons of them today. They pretty much do everything that they could. They swim, they crawl, they live in trees. Really the only thing mollusks don't do, haven't evolved really, is flying. And the idea of a flying slug is so disgusting, I don't even want to think about it. But other than that, they are incredibly diverse and successful group of animals. So the second part of the title, The Curious Afterlife, isn't the bit where I talk about snail ghosts. I'm not into that kind of stuff. It's really the other part of the book is about the relationships between people and shells and mollusks, and how when we and our ancestors going back thousands of years have found empty shells on beaches, we've picked them up and wondered what they are and looked at their beautiful shapes and pondered that and put them to all sorts of different uses, and I think made the afterlife, if you like, of the shells, the bits they've left behind that we keep using. That's a wonderful and glorious thing, and so many beliefs and uses that we have of seashells. So that was the other thing that I wanted to do in the book, was to tell some of those stories, especially some of the lesser known stories of mollusks and shells and the way that people have used them. So one of the most common and one of the interactions that pretty much all of us probably have at some point, unless you're squeamish about shellfish, is we eat a lot of mollusks. I've just been to Japan and snapped a few photos in the fish market of just a few of the different mollusks I saw on display. I didn't really fancy eating any of these, to be honest. Snails really aren't on my menu, but some enormous mussels looked kind of interesting as well. So they've been important food for people for a very, very long time. But the shells themselves that these mollusks leave behind have been used in all sorts of extraordinary ways. So they were very early currencies, they were very early jewellery. One of the things that really surprised me as I was writing the book was just how significant seashells have been for people, going like all the way around the world, thousands of years back in time, to places a long way from the oceans. There are still great beliefs in something different about seashells. They seem to represent this hidden world, the oceans, which for a long time people didn't really know anything about, and I think that's partly why there were all these beliefs surrounding seashells. One of my favourite examples, which I do write about in the book, of an ancient piece of shell use, and it's a piece of jewellery, is this guy. So you might just be able to make out on his arm up there a sort of a white bangle. Now this is a grave from Bulgaria that was found in the 70s, but it was dated to about 6,500 years ago. It dates from a time called Old Europe. And up until the discovery of this grave and a whole bunch of other ones, it was generally thought that at that point in time, Europeans were kind of a fairly egalitarian bunch. There were no general signs, there was no obvious signs of an elite or anyone who was in charge. They all were just pastoralists getting on with things. And then they found this grave and lots of others filled with gold, and clearly this is the guy who was in charge. But what really fascinates me is that, yes, there's lots of gold adornments to the clothes he was wearing and parts of his body and jewellery and so on, but there is that piece that's made of seashells as well. And I feel that maybe it had a similar level of value and it was as much a treasure as all that gold. Now that particular bangle is made out of a shell called spondylus, also known as the thorny oyster. That's it when it's alive. It has this very colourful mantle, which is a large part of its body. It's actually the bit that makes the shell. And again, a bit like a clam, like a giant clam, it's very colourful. And I think they might have algae in them as well. And then when it's dead, you can see it's got these lovely spines which help things to grow on it. And we think that's partly a sort of defensive mechanism so that it gets smothered in sponges and seaweed that is fairly bad tasting and good camouflage for the shell. But this spondylus was used to carve that particular piece of jewellery, and it was actually a really important material that was used all across Europe. There have been similar findings found all the way up to Paris. I should say that these came from the Mediterranean. There's a large species of spondylus that grows there. So even this grave in Bulgaria was a fairly long way from there, especially considering 7,000 years ago. And we think there were trade networks across the continent, and these materials were passed on, they were reworked, and they were clearly very valuable. And the thing I find particularly fascinating about this one is if you can just make out those two gold parts on that bangle. So what we think happened is that actually that was carved out of a single really big shell and then deliberately broken and fixed with gold plating and then buried with this guy. Or possibly even that he had to have had that put on his arm when he was quite young and that he wouldn't be able to fit it over his elbow. Some of the other bangles, there's tons of spondylus bangles that have been found across Europe, and a lot of them are similar, found in the same part of the body. A lot of them have been broken. And most of this, the answers to why that is, we don't really have. It's quite a mystery still, which I think is rather wonderful. There's people who were treasuring these objects from the ocean a very long time ago and placing them in graves and instilling them great meaning. And we see shells in graves around the world. We actually see a lot of use of spondylus on the other side of the world in Central and South America at about the similar sort of time. No, much later. But they were using the same shells. They were using them as decorations. They were actually putting whole spondylus shells in graves with people. They were clearly something that has captured human imagination for a long time. And I think that sort of still continues today. We continue to be fascinated by shells and the shapes they make and the things that they do. So I rather like that kind of connection that we have to our ancestors and to people long ago who similarly like us find these things and wonder, what is this? Where did it come from? But that connection to shells and the way we use them is certainly not something that's just all in antiquity and history. Some of the most exciting science that's coming out of the mollusk world was something else I wanted to write about in the book. And again, I was kind of fascinated, I was kind of amazed that so many new discoveries are being found in the mollusk group of animals. And a lot of it's really fantastic and very useful and important, I think, beyond just the sheer fascination of the things that we're discovering. So one of the lovely mollusk discoveries that's come about in the last decade or so is this guy, the scaly foot gastropod. Now, it was, I think, discovered in 2001, something like that, on a hydrothermal vent, so about 2,000 or 3,000 meters beneath the waves in the Indian Ocean. And you get these cracks in the seabed, and you have black smokers forming when seawater gushes up through the seafloor and deposits minerals and forms these huge tall towers. And they were originally discovered in the 70s in the Galapagos Islands, and since then we found they were all around the world at the edges of continental and oceanic plates. And this guy was found amongst really extraordinary rich ecosystems that we find on hydrothermal vents in places you wouldn't really expect to see anything alive at all. It's permanently dark, completely cut off from the sunlight. It's very hot, it's full of minerals and metals and things that are difficult. But life has found a way, and this particular mollusk has found a very exciting way to survive in such extreme conditions. It has made itself a shell out of iron. It's the only mollusk we know that does this. All of the others pretty much use calcium carbonate, chalk essentially. But this one has a 3-layered shell, and on the outside is an iron compound. It's covered its foot, which is the soft, squishy bit of a snail that it crawls along on. It's covered it in these almost like a chainmail, again from this iron-based compound, as a protective mechanism, we think, to stop it from being probably attacked by other snails actually that have poison darts and things like that. So that was probably what it's doing. And the shell, the iron-based shell, is incredibly strong. Scientists have brought back specimens up from the deep and put them in tests in laboratories, and they've tried everything they can to squeeze and smash and break them, and found that they've evolved to be crack resistant. They basically are incredibly tough shock absorbers as well. And it's the only organism that we found so far that does something like that with its body armour. So that in itself is a wonderful discovery, but as always, and as often is the case, then the ideas of, well, can we do something similar start to arise, and could we make armour that's this capable of resisting such stresses and strains and so on, so can it inspire us to do similar things? And that's sort of hand it over to the engineers and see what they can do with it. So the scalyfoots are really quite a wonderful group of animals, but you don't have to go to the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean to scorching hot hydrothermal vents to find new and fabulous discoveries about mollusks. These chaps recently were rather excited, had a new and exciting discovery. Limpets, again, quite a common sight if you've been to any beaches, and they don't really look like they're alive, but when the tide is out, they clamp themselves to rocks like little conical volcanoes, and keep themselves nice and moist inside so they don't dry out. But yeah, we've pretty much all seen limpets. They're nothing we would think particularly exciting. But it turns out that they do something really extraordinary, something we have known about, but it took a long time, it seems, for someone to wonder how that actually works. So limpets, they're a type of snail, and they spend their lives eating thin films of seaweed that grow on rocks, sort of the slimy stuff that you can see around this photo. And they do that by scraping at it with their teeth. So they spend their lives basically, can you imagine if your food was spread out in a thin layer on a rock and you had to sort of scrape it off with your teeth, how strong your teeth would have to be so that they don't just fall apart. So finally, someone thought to have a look inside the mouth of a limpet and see how they do this. Their teeth are actually made out of, again, a slightly different version of calcium carbonate with, I think it's got iron in it as well, a compound called goethite. And they took some of this material, some very tiny bits of this, put it into various testing equipment in the lab, and found that this is the toughest natural material that we found yet. It's way stronger than spider silk. Up until now, it's kind of been spider silk that's the strongest and the toughest material. These guys now win. So limpets have incredibly strong teeth. Apparently, they could, if they wanted to, they could chew through bulletproof armour. They're incredibly strong. So again, a little bit like those scaly-foot gastropods, what can we learn from that, and how can we use this and understand what's behind the strength of their teeth, and can we mimic this and do you make useful things out of it? So that's another. But they were just sitting there the whole time, and people didn't wonder what was going on beneath those little shells. There's one other group of mollusks that I think are producing some of the most exciting findings, scientific findings at the moment, and that's the cone snails. And I don't know if any of you have come across or heard about these guys. There's several hundred species of them. They mostly live in the tropics. And they're pretty much the only mollusk group of the mollusks that I would say best to leave alone, because there's a couple of species that could kill you if they feel so inclined. They have incredibly strong, incredibly potent poisons in their teeth. Yet again, it's the teeth we're looking at. It's sort of a funny conundrum that's taken a little while for scientists to wonder how do they do this. But these slow-moving snails, some of them eat fish. And they do this by shooting these teeth out at them, which instantly paralyzes them so that they don't swim off. And that's the only way that would work, because a tiny, slow-moving snail, fast-moving fish. Admittedly, they do mostly attack while the fish are asleep, so that helps. But if they were to wake them up or give them even more than a couple of seconds notice, then the fish would be gone, and maybe it would die a few feet away, but that's not much use, or a few meters away. It's not much use for that snail. So they've evolved these incredibly potent toxins. We call them conotoxins as a general thing, but they're amazingly diverse. Small, mostly peptides that we find in their spit. And an individual species will have hundreds of different peptides in their venom. Studies were sort of beginning, I think, in the 70s and the 80s, when scientists were starting to look at these molecules to try and understand how they work and what's going on with them, and discovered that they were a really, really interesting group of molecules. They are incredibly specific in how they affect the nervous system of different organisms. And because they attack fish, it means they're tuned into vertebrate nervous systems, which means that they have become incredibly useful as tools for understanding more about our own bodies. And I'm sure some of you know about this kind of stuff, given your background and your interests, but I certainly, as a marine scientist, found it really fascinating that there's this crossover between, a really tangible, real crossover, I think, between marine science and discoveries in the ocean and medical advances and how we can use this thing. This isn't just, what could we do one day? This is actually incredibly important and is a hugely important tool today. For studies and also to produce new medicines. So I believe conotoxins of various types are a kind of a workhorse tool in research labs around the world, in studies of how brains work and nerves, and that you can use them to switch off certain bits and certain receptors in the brain in various parts of the nervous system, and understand more about how that works, how diseases are affecting that nervous system. But there are also several medicines that have already been developed based on these conotoxins. There's a painkiller, I think, that's available in the United States that switches off the connections between pain receptors in the brain. This is very good for, I think, chronic pain is a really good use for that. And then, just as I was finishing writing the book, there was another discovery in a new paper published. I got to that point where it was sort of getting near to the end of me having to submit the manuscript, and then new stuff would keep coming out in the science press that I'd be like, can I just put this one in? This one's really great. I really want to put this story in too. So I think this was the last one I finally got in, which is not only do cone snails have these toxins in their spit, but it was discovered that they also puff sedative into the water. That is in fact a form of insulin that they've evolved to be almost exactly the same, certainly functionally, as the insulin that vertebrates, including ourselves, produce. And that's the only known case that we've discovered so far of weaponized insulin. And that they're using this as basically as a way to put these fish into hypoglycemic shock for their blood sugar levels to drop, and then lo and behold, slow little snail can creep up to this little still fish and engulf them. They have, if you've ever seen, I don't have a video actually, but if you've ever interested in how a cone snail eats a fish, do Google it. There's some extraordinary video of how they stretch their enormous their mouths out very big to swallow a fish whole, and they sit down in the sand and digest. And then a bit later they'll spit out some scales and some bones at the end. It's quite amazing. Really good for Halloween. So this idea of discovery really of insulin being used by cone snails was quite recent. And actually there was a new part of the story that just came out last month, which was the next stage in that analysis of this molecule that the cone snails produce. And the discovery that, basically the question was, how is it that this tiny molecule seems to be very, very effective as an insulin-like, has insulin-like effects. And a group of researchers from Australia just last month have published a new study that have looked at the structure of this mollusk insulin and discovered that it's much simpler than the human insulin. Correct me if I'm wrong, this is from the Science press release I've read just earlier today, but it was telling me that it seems that human insulin certainly comes in different segments and parts that are connected by a hinge, which makes it quite bulky, and that this could slow down its effect because it slows down how quickly it can diffuse through the body. I hope that's right. But that in contrast, this mollusk insulin molecule actually has just a single amino acid that does the same thing, making it much smaller and potentially much faster, it's more effective and quicker. And they've tested this insulin on human receptors and shown that it does have the same effect, maybe not quite as potent as human insulin, but it does seem to work. And then so really, I think the next stage in terms of possibly trying to make a better human insulin molecule for people, diabetics who are having problems with their own production of insulin and perhaps need a very quick hit in that effect. Maybe if we could make human insulin a little bit more snail-like and perhaps be inspired by this amino acid replacing this big hinge, perhaps that would help us in treating certain diseases. So the cone snails, I think, are a fabulous group, and just showing us beyond just mere curiosity, just how important and useful the mollusks can be, and how that sort of the use of and the connection between us and the natural world is strong as ever, I think, and continues to be absolutely fascinating. Now, we are still finding lots of new species of mollusks. One thing I wanted to do when I was writing the book was get an idea of how many we know of and how many there might be out there that we haven't discovered. And there's still lots we haven't actually found yet. This is a composite slide, it's in the book. These are micromollusks. They were all discovered in Papua New Guinea a couple of years ago, just before the book went out. And they're all about 5 millimeters long. They're absolutely tiny. And certainly when this picture was taken, and I think still this is the case, that none of these have been identified scientifically. They've just been found. And actually, I'd like just to read you a little bit from the book that describes how these were found and what they might tell us about the mollusks. So, in the summer of 2014, Philip Boucher led a team of mollusk hunters to Nago, an island off the coast of Papua New Guinea, which lies in the coral-dotted lagoon stretching between the Bismarck Sea and the Pacific Ocean. I should just say that Philip Boucher is a guy from the Natural History Museum in Paris, and this is his job, is to go and find new mollusks. This spot lies towards the eastern end of the Coral Triangle, the place where there are more marine species than anywhere else on the planet. Throughout years of field trips in Vanuatu, Madagascar, the Philippines and elsewhere, Boucher and colleagues from dozens of countries have been honing their collecting techniques. Divers venture out both day and night, so as not to miss the nocturnal species. They drop sampling devices down to varying depths where, like layers of a forest canopy, different assemblies of animals are found. They search between the tides. They even check among the spines of sea urchins and the tube feet of starfish for parasitic snails that suck the echinoderm's bodily fluids. The teams have also begun taking snippets of tissue to preserve the animal's DNA, so species can be identified from their genetic fingerprint. Using this suite of meticulous methods, the collectors are probing deeper than ever into the world of mollusks. In particular, they're uncovering an incalculable trove of micromollusks. These weeny animals are truly the secret gems of the sea. They come in a riot of exquisite colours, like a jar of jelly beans, with neon spots and stripes, yellow, purple, green and red. There are tiny clams with a sweep of pink tentacles sticking out, snails with glassy transparent shells and kaleidoscopic mantles that show through from underneath, and bivalves that unfurl their colourful mantles over their shells and crawl about on their feet as if they were gastropods. So bivalves are the group of mollusks that include the ones with two shells, the clams and cockles, and the gastropods are the snails and the slugs, spiralling shells. Almost nothing is known about these animals. We don't know what they eat, what eats them, what strange and useful molecules they might contain, or where exactly they belong on the sprawling tree of molluscan life. There are so few experts who specialise in these minute species that many of the samples Boucher and the team collect could remain for years on a museum shelf, found and logged, but not fully identified. Taxonomists call these neglected species orphans. Even greater mysteries remain to be unravelled, hidden in oceanic nooks where molluscs reside, but no one has yet worked out how to get hold of them. Divers from Boucher's team went gathering molluscs along a vertical wall of coral that plunges into the Bismarck Sea 1,000 metres beneath the waves. The wall is pockmarked with caves, inside which the divers found a tantalising array of previously unknown shells, all of them between 1 and 5 millimetres in size, and all of them empty and dead. No matter how hard they tried and how carefully they looked, they couldn't find a single living mollusk responsible for making these enigmatic shells. The animals probably live deep within the cracks of this towering wall. The only reason we know they exist at all is because their shells drop down into the hands of the diving scientists. And we can only imagine what else lives in there, out of reach and out of sight. So it kind of made me want to go and become a mollusk hunter, actually, just talking to Philip and the sort of things he got to do. And it was in his view that it could be that there are maybe 200,000 species of mollusk, including all the ones we haven't yet found. There's about 50,000 that have so far been logged and catalogued, but maybe 200,000. And that's a lot of species. I mean, the only group really that beats them are the insects. There's about 1 million insects, fair enough, but mollusks come a very good second. And it really is extraordinary to think what else we might discover in this fabulous group of animals. And, you know, we desperately do need new experts coming up to help describe and understand this wonderful world. Now, it's not just counting species, it's not just finding new medicines in mollusks that people have been doing with them over the years. Seashells have also posed some big questions that people have spent a long time thinking about. And one in particular that I wanted to address in the book was the shape of shells and how that's come about and whether we can understand more about what we're looking at in terms of all of this wonderful diversity. And it's a question that's been bothering people for a very long time. It was in fact the philosopher René Descartes who came up with a part of this question, an answer to part of this question in terms of, is there a mathematical elegance to seashells that we can get to grips with and that we can understand? And it was his idea that part of the spiral of a shell, this is the nautilus shell cut through the middle, and the chambered nautilus. And it was his idea that really this conforms to a mathematical equation that he called the logarithmic spiral, which is what you can see on the top right-hand corner. Basically, it's a spiral as it spins out from the center that expands at a constant rate. It doesn't really matter the details of that, but we see these logarithmic spirals all around nature, not just in shells, we see them in expanding galaxies. It's the path that a moth would take as it flies towards a candle. It's a very constant shape we see in nature. But it does help us to explain at least that sort of the beginnings of the complexity of seashells, certainly in 2 dimensions. But, as I'm sure you've all noticed, shells are 3-dimensional, and that's where some of their beauty really lies in what's going on as the spiraling shells are doing things in 3 dimensions that are really quite interesting. And it was in the early part of the 20th century that another scientist picked up this idea of how do we understand the mathematics of shells and shell making. And it was a guy called Darcy Wentworth Thompson, and he thought a lot about shapes in nature and where they come from and how we can explain them. But seashells were one thing that he wrote about. And it was his idea that maybe all you need are 4 simple, fairly simple pieces of mathematics to describe all of the seashells. And for him, it was really just a thought experiment. He didn't get a chance to actually test this out. Now, I don't know if you can just make this out. So one of those rules is the logarithmic spiral that Descartes came up with. The other 3, basically what he's doing is he's imagining that a shell is created when a 2-dimensional circle spins in 3 dimensions along an axis. So a bit like a spinning top, imagine that, but as it's going, it's sort of trailing out this shell as it goes down. And if you look at maybe just 3 other aspects of what's going on with that, maybe what we can then do is make any possible shell. So he considered, all right, what about T, sort of the trajectory of that axis? Is it a shell that's very stumpy and doesn't expand out much, or is it a very tall shell? So we can change that factor going across. The distance between the middle of the shell and each individual whirl, we can have a kind of chubby shell, or we can have a skinny wormy one, which is this one, D in the middle. And then the other idea he had was it depends on how quickly the spiral expands outwards, which we call the whirl expansion rate. Don't worry too much about the details of this, but it's just the idea that he thought we could tweak this model of how to make shells really quite simply, and maybe with just those 4 rules we can make any possible shell. And he left it at that. He said it was a bit of a thought experiment, he didn't have a chance to test it out. And it was in the 1950s that another scientist came along and picked up his ideas and had a go at actually seeing if this was the case. It was a guy called David Raup. He was a paleontologist, very interested in evolution and how we can make and how we can see these different shapes being formed in nature and why and how they evolve. And he did something quite unusual for a paleontologist, certainly at this time. He used a computer, and the computer looked like this. It was a mainframe computer. It was kind of thing that was supposed to be used for making spacecraft and nuclear reactors and so on, but he managed to persuade them to let him have a bit of time overnight to have a go at making shells. And what he did was he took those equations from Thomson and he plugged them into a computer program. He changed each of those little values just a little bit at a time and came up with an output. Now, when he did this, he, again, it was quite a while ago, he couldn't do fancy things with graphics. They were all just drawings in 2 dimensions. But since then, we've actually been able to, someone's put together a really nice visual output of what David Raup found. What David Raup showed was that, yes, you can get an extraordinary diversity of shapes from those 4 basic equations. He called it the Museum of All Possible Shells. His output from those equations were shells of all shapes that we've seen, and also a lot of shells that we don't see in nature. The really fascinating thing he discovered, and it kind of opened up a whole new area of evolutionary research, was that his museum, yes, isn't completely filled with real species. There's a whole load that haven't evolved. It's got people thinking about what's possible in terms of different shapes in nature and what's actually evolved. And now we have aquarium tanks of all possible fish, and we have similar things for plants and seaweeds and so on. People exploring the possibilities of shape and then looking at what we actually see and seeing that there's usually a difference between the 2. So basically this is sort of panning through those different values in that model, and now you can see just how you can get extraordinary different shapes of shells. He's tweaking a few other things like the cross-section of the flat open end, but that is extraordinary when you see how a spiraling shell actually can be a clam shell. You wouldn't think of it as being a spiral, but actually it is. It's just one that whirls, it just flares out very quickly. I find it just very kind of soothing and mesmerizing to see shells evolving in front of your eyes. And I mean, it's not the mollusks themselves are mathematicians. They aren't doing these little calculations as they're making their shells. They make one shell their entire life. They keep it and don't cast off a new one, and don't cast it off and make a new one like crabs do. Mollusks keep their shells. They make them by adding material to that open end with their mantle. So in a sense, they are sort of wrapping themselves up in this calcium carbonate shell as they grow. And yeah, you can get this extraordinary diversity just from fairly simple bits of mathematics. So I think that's just absolutely wonderful, and just shows how long we've been thinking about mollusks and their shells and the beautiful things that they can create. So there you go. Thank you for bearing with me on that. So one last thing I wanted to talk to you about is, well, the answer to the question I'm often asked, mostly by kids, because kids ask the best questions. No offence to anyone who wants to ask questions at the end, but kids do ask great questions. But that one is, which is my favourite mollusk? there's 200,000 species, how can I choose one? But if I am forced to answer, then I will say it's the Argonauts. There's a few different species of these, and I'm captivated by them particularly for various reasons, which I shall go into. These are the only, I said that octopus don't have shells. Well, I was actually lying, there are a few that do, and this is the Argonauts. They're also known as paper nautilus. Not actually that closely related to the chambered nautilus, but they do look a little bit similar. This is a drawing of their shells. They're calcium carbonate still like the other mollusks, but they're very thin and papery, hence their name. And the octopus that we find inside these shells have fascinated scientists again for really a very long time, and lots of stories have been told about them. They feature in the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and this illustrates one of the kind of stories that were told by scientists actually. I think it's one of my favourite books. It's sort of one of the original popular science books. It was stories, but really it was mostly the kind of cutting edge science at the time that was being written about. But it illustrates one of the ideas that people had about Argonauts, which was that these octopus basically used those shells as little boats, and that it would sit on top of the water and float around. And you can just make out these funny shapes sticking up like ears. And it was thought that the octopus, they do have, at the end of two of their arms, the Argonauts have got these big web-like structures. And it was thought that they stick those in the air and catch the breeze and sail themselves along in these little boats. Or either that or they use the other arms to row themselves through the water. And there's a piece of the book that describes this discovery by the marine biologist who's been kidnapped by Captain Nemo in his submarine called the Nautilus, appropriately enough. So I was very jealous of that marine biologist actually rereading that book. I always thought I'd quite like to do that, go off and have adventures around the ocean. But anyway, so yes, this was genuinely thought that maybe Argonauts do float around in their shells like little boats. But the other big puzzle was whether or not the octopus that we found and were being found living inside these shells, do they make their shells or do they steal them from something else that we haven't yet discovered? Some other organism that maybe lives down in the deep. Do these octopus, run up to them, grab their shells, perhaps eat the occupant first and then sail off in this stolen shell? It seems like a silly story, but it was actually, something that we didn't know. Scientists weren't sure what was going on. There was kind of two camps of thought. One that they make their own shells and the other that they're parasites. And I think really one of the reasons I do particularly love Argonauts is that the person who finally solved this question about the truth of Argonauts was this lady, Jeanville-Power. So she was around in the middle of the 19th century. Her story herself is rather wonderful. She grew up in rural France. She walked to Paris to become a seamstress, and she made the wedding dress for a princess, and at the wedding party met James Power, who she then married, and he whisked her off to Sicily to become a lady of leisure. But there she didn't continue just being a gentle seamstress. She rolled up her sleeves and became a freelance scientist. Doing science at a time when women really weren't doing this kind of thing. But she was a sort of Gerald Durrell of her day. Her house was full of creatures that she would bring in and study. And she was particularly fascinated by the ocean. She's credited with inventing the aquarium tank. She built these structures in her house out of glass that she filled with seawater and creatures that she could then study. And she was particularly interested in this question of the Argonauts. And I write about it in the book, and I'll leave you to follow that up if you are interested to see what she did. But it was really a very elegant set of scientific experiments that she did with Argonauts. They live in the Mediterranean, and fishermen would bring them in for her to work with. Apparently she does sometimes catch them herself. And she conducted a series of tests to figure out what was going on. And I don't think it spoils the ending to tell you that she did discover that they do indeed make their own shells. It's the females that do it. The males are generally nowhere to be seen. They're tiny and small compared to the females, and really just contribute their sperm when the female needs it. In fact, she can even carry the sperm around in her shell for a while until she needs it. But she mainly uses that shell as a brood chamber to keep her young in. Most octopus actually lay their eggs on the seabed. Some of them will sit by them and guard them for years at a time. It's a deep sea octopus that I think has been seen for about 4 years, sitting next to her clutch of eggs before they hatch, which is extraordinary. But these guys swim around with them in the open sea, carrying their babies with them before they hatch. And that brings me to the final thing, and I was going to come back to, which is the title of the book, Spirals in Time. And just how hard I found it trying to decide what to call this book. When I originally was approached and signed a deal with Bloomsbury to write the book, we had another title, but it was bad, and it didn't take us long to realise that we didn't like that title. So throughout much of the duration of me writing the book, it didn't have a title. It was just the book about shells. And I was getting close to the point where we really had to decide what the title was going to be. Because people want to know, you have to tell bookshops and that kind of thing. And it was when I was writing this chapter about Argonauts and about Joinville Pro Power, and I was just obsessed with Argonauts, couldn't see anything else in the world at that point. And I decided I wanted to call the book The Flight of the Argonauts. Partly because actually one other thing that we now know that Argonauts use their shells for is they do probably, we think, put bubbles of air inside them and use them a little bit like chambered nautilus do to sort of keep them floating along underwater in a slightly more rudimentary way, but that's what they do. So I kind of imagine these fleets of Argonauts floating around the ocean, flying through the ocean. Flight of the Argonauts, fantastic. It also happened that I discovered this drawing at the same time. I was really very pleased that Bloomsbury asked me to be involved in the cover of the book, because my previous book I had nothing to do with. It was fine, but I really wasn't involved in that part of it. And I think often authors aren't really. They're sort of considered to be the wordsmiths, and that everything else is not their area of expertise. But Bloomsbury very kindly asked me if I had any ideas of who would want to do the illustrations and so on. And I found this drawing when I was doing my kind of mega Argonaut searches of the internet and thought it was rather wonderful. And looked up the artist, discovered it was this chap called Aaron John Gregory, who's based in California, and said I'd really like him to do the cover. So we approached him and we had to exchange some emails, and he kind of turned out to be the perfect person to do this. He was a marine biologist, he was retraining as an artist, he was just as kind of nerdy about mollusks and sea creatures as I am. It turned out he'd just been on holiday and come back. He'd found an Argonaut shell on the beach on an island off California. So I was like, we have to have this guy, he's perfect. And so he agreed, thankfully, which was lovely. And so we said, okay, Flight of the Argonauts, do us a front cover for Flight of the Argonauts. We weren't going to use this Argonaut particularly, we wanted some original artwork. So what I'm going to show you is just some of the sketches that we had that he sent over to us as we were developing this idea. So it was me in Cambridge, my editor in London, and Aaron in California were kind of chewing over ideas for what this was going to look like. So originally Flight of the Argonauts, and he came up with these sketches, which I really love. I would have loved actually particularly the top right-hand corner, tentacles and eyes and things. That was fantastic, I loved it. But after that, my editors decided that we couldn't really call it Flight of the Argonauts. It's not a book about Argonauts, it's a book about lots of mollusks, so we need to think again. And it was really coming down to the wire, and I just couldn't think of what to call it, and we kept on coming up with things that were horrid and awful, and we just didn't know what to call it. So I think I basically said to my editor, just one more weekend. I was going on holiday to Devon, to North Devon, to one of my favourite bits of the British coast, and I thought, well, maybe I'll get some inspiration just being out on the coast and looking at some mollusks and so on. So just give me till Monday, please. So he said, fine. And actually it did work. There I was, rock pooling and having a look at all these wonderful creatures, and I just thought, well, they're spirals in shape. And a lot of the stories I'm telling are about time, whether it's human time or evolutionary time. So how about spirals in time? Fine, it's good, we'll go with it. Okay, good, we have a title, fantastic. So there we go. But now we had to figure out what to put on the front cover. And actually, by this point, I decided really there were two things that really mattered to me. One was that they were living creatures on the front cover. I didn't want them just to be dead, empty shells. A big part of the point of the book is that these are creatures that we should consider as being fascinating, wonderful, living things, not just stuff they leave, not just the bits they leave behind when they die. So living creatures, please, and lots of species. Maybe not 200,000, that might be a bit too many, but lots of different types of mollusks. So we sent those instructions off to Aaron, and he came back with this little sketch of the front and the back covers. I quite like this one. but my editor said, no, it's too busy. Where can we put the text? You know, all these boring things that books have to have. So, okay, fine. And actually it was my editor, Jim Martin's idea to put a spiral of mollusks on the front cover. Ha-ha, a spiral's in time. So we said, Aaron, can you do us a spiral? And he said, sure. Do you want them coming out at you from the middle or coming down from the top? So we said coming out at you, absolutely, we like that. So he went ahead and did some sketches for the detail of the species we were going to have. A couple of these things changed, but basically he drew it out in pencil. Then he inked this in with a paintbrush and ink, which I thought was really cool. So he did this all by hand. And then he coloured it in by computer, which I thought was, again, sort of something I didn't know that this is what artists do these days. He used a tablet, coloured it in, sent that back to us, and then Bloomsbury put together a bunch of different colour possibilities, and I asked all my friends and family, and everyone agreed that this was the one to go for, and that's what we chose. And I really love the front cover. I'm just delighted that it does everything I wanted it to do. There's a bit less of it visible now because of all these quotes from Guardian and so on the front, but that was the hardback was wonderful. Aaron, we also asked him to do, there's an illustration at the beginning of each chapter, and I'd just like to show you the sketches of those two because I think they're rather lovely. This is his cone snail doing what cone snails do. That's the pencil, and then he inked it in beautifully for us. So that's a chapter on cone snails. These are the sea butterflies. The final chapter in the book is about ocean acidification, this part of climate change that's likely to affect mollusks and their beautiful shells. So those are the tiny snails that swim through the open ocean. Very, very beautiful. And then this guy, this is the biggest ammonite that ever evolved. So the extinct group of mollusks that look a bit like the nautiluses, but they're in fact different. This chap was 3 meters in diameter, which is extraordinary. Probably the biggest seashell that ever evolved, with some sharks for scale down the side. So that's Parapososia. A reconstruction. We've never actually found there's never been a fossil found with the soft parts of an ammonite, so all of that stuff is just a guess, but a good guess probably, of tentacles and so on. So there you go. So that's the chapter about, actually that's the chapter about argonauts and ammonites and similar sorts of things. So those are my stories of mollusks. I just would like to dedicate my talk to the very great late Terry Pratchett, who did say, if you can count to 2, you can count to anything. And then the world is your mollusk. So thank you very much for listening.